Be on April the 14th. We're going to have Emily McCoy from Andropogon here, and I'm sure it will be an interesting evening. Tonight we're really pleased to have Chris Reed return to URI. I think it was 10 years ago when he was here first, and we're pleased to have him tonight. He's a founding principal of STOSS, Landscape Urbanism. Their office is in Boston, and he started the firm in 2000. He's also an associate professor of practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's a landscape architect registered in 5 or 6 states and in Canada, has more than 20 years of professional experience. He received a master's in landscape architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, and an undergraduate degree in urbanism from Harvard College. Under his direction, the firm has built an international reputation with built projects and winning competitions in the United States, in Canada, Europe, Israel, the Middle East, Taiwan, and China. Domestic projects have been designed and installed in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Cambridge, Dallas, Louisville, Washington, D.C. The firm's work has been recognized for excellence, having received the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in 2012, top honor for City Deck in the Excellence on the Waterfront Awards program, and quite impressive, the Topos Landscape Award in 2010 as the most outstanding landscape architecture and urban design firm of that year. Chris has also received numerous awards, National ASLA Awards, BSLA, ASLA Michigan Chapter Awards. The work has been recognized by Progressive Architecture, the Architectural League of New York, and the Van Allen Institute. Chris is a theorist and a writer. He's also co-edited a book with Nina Marie Lister from California called Projective Ecologies in 2013. He's had pieces in the Harvard Design Magazine, Places Journal, Topos. Most recently, a studio of ours used an article that he had written on resilient cities in the issue of Resilient Cities. His recent works have been published or are forthcoming in Landscape Journal, Garten and Landschaft, that's not an American publication, Landscape Architecture Magazine, and the Journal of Architecture. He's a busy and accomplished professional, and we should be quite pleased to have him here this evening. Will you welcome Chris Reed?
Thanks, Will. Can you all hear me all right? I always laugh at the 20 years experience thing, because that's the type of thing you write into your marketing materials, because it makes clients feel confident and comfortable, and it makes me just feel old. Appreciate the invitation. Will was very generous 10 years ago to have me when we were a fledgling firm of 5 years out of the block trying to figure out what we're doing. And he contacted me probably, last fall, and was quite persistent about getting me here the second time. So it's nice to be back, and nice that you all came out, particularly on a nice day. It was 74 degrees at 1 o'clock in Boston today when I was running on the beach. So I appreciate you guys all being willing to come inside a building on what was pretty decent day. There's my screen again. So the talk tonight will address the nature of what we do, broadly, as a practice generated from ideas and centered on design, and also as a hybrid studio that's informed and cross-pollinated by research, experimentation, and teaching. I started the practice with a question and a research project. The question was this: how might landscape play a more prominent and formative role in the imagining and remaking of public spaces, infrastructures, and entire cities. When I was in school, we were emerging from an era where landscape architecture was very closely wedded to one of two lineages. One was large-scale regional planning, a la Ian McHarg, but absent, so very sensitive to natural systems, large-scale, even infrastructural systems, but where design culture was largely absent, I'd argue. And also a lineage that was very design-oriented, but was limited to gardens and other kinds of landscape. And I think in the last 10, 20 years, there's been a resurgence of interest in the city and the way that landscape and landscape architects can play a much more important, critical, formative role in the way that we think about how cities are made. The research project was eventually made its way into this book, The Landscape Urbanism Reader by Charles Waldheim. It was called Public Works Practices, and I was interested in exploring more expansive entrepreneurial forms of practice, not just sitting around as a designer waiting for a client to come to us, or for us to respond to somebody else's our request for proposals or project brief. I was interested in the way that we could help formulate those briefs, how we could help set the table for projects to come, and how we might step outside the role of a designer even after a project is constructed to look at some of the ongoing administrative and maintenance and operations regimes that could help inform those kinds of practices. So it's a much more expansive view of what landscape practice was at the time. When we started the work, though, I worked for 6 years at Hargraves Associates, but you kind of start your own shop, and it's not like, you have 100 clients knocking on the door. You have to kind of build a reputation. You have to build an ethic about what you're doing and what you do. And I made a very deliberate choice that I wanted to focus a lot on public work, public projects, not so much on private gardens or residential design, because for me it was in the public realm that you could really take on some of the complex issues: ecology, environment, infrastructure, all these things which we had learned about in school, and could come to form what I thought was a more ambitious but also a more impactful version of landscape. So, when you're right out the door, you don't have cities coming to you saying, we'd like to take the most inexperienced studio around and give them the most complex projects. So we ended up doing a lot of limited competition, invited competition work, which allowed us to take on some of the bigger projects. So this is the Lower Donlands, 300 acres on the waterfront in Toronto, which involved moving a river, reworking how that river worked and kind of building a city fabric around it. So rather than starting with the urban fabric first, we started with the river ecologies, what would give life to those forms of life, and then figured out how to build some pretty intense urban and social spaces around that. We also took on small installation projects and even some small public projects as a way to experiment and as a way to just show public clients that we could get projects done. So on the one hand, we had very ambitious projects that were, they typically lost competitions, but were meaningful in terms of establishing our reputation. And then a series of smaller projects. This was a little garden installation. It actually came out of a conversation we were having. We were doing a playground in Somerville, Mass., and wanted to take some topography and use this rubber, standard rubber playground surfacing. And the client was freaking out because they had only seen it installed flat. We said, no, you can do it, three-dimensionally. They wouldn't let us do it because they hadn't seen it. They were a public client, they were a bit conservative. And so we used this garden installation to create this kind of undulating carpet, right? to, on the one hand, test the material. This thing survived. It was only supposed to be there 1 year. It ended up surviving 3 harsh winters in northeast Quebec. And so, it gives us a good thing to point to say, on the one hand, just from a material construction technology viewpoint, there's something here, we can use it as a model. On the other hand, for us, it was also about open-ended play. It wasn't about play equipment that told kids what to do. It was about creating a topography that people just began to engage with. And of course, kids were really good at this. They would make up games. They'd bounce and jump and do all sorts of things. The construction manager loved this project, would make everybody take their shoes off so you could really feel the squishiness of the surfaces with your feet and toes, and then would allow people to kind of wander through it. So it was a great experiment for us in a material technology and also in an idea about free and creative play. And, I also became interested in infrastructure on a number of levels, and particularly through seminar work at school. Did a lot of research around 20th century cities like LA built on and around infrastructure, just to really understand what is it that made cities like this work, and how is it that we could co-opt some of these infrastructural systems that were in play. So whether it's water and power systems here, drinking water systems, debris basins. We were looking for the ways in which, even though these things were highly engineered, highly controlled, we were looking for those moments where actually they had a dynamism in life. And we looked for ways to project that and represent that through the work we were doing with students. And so all these things were how I began to put the practice, the teaching, some of the research together. They were all the different kinds of starting points for where we've gotten to. And it's led to projects like this, a speculative project that'll be published in the LA Times in a couple weeks, that looks at shutting down one of the freeway stubs and remaking it as a social and environmental machine. So really turning the freeway on its head, freeways that shed water as quickly as possible. Now this one becomes a collector of water. Freeways that are generating carbon exhaust emissions, have elements that actually catch and capture smog and carbon and put it back, clean up the air and put the carbon back into the ground. So something that's in many ways a kind of machine for urban and ecological and social life in the heart of one of the most contemporary and evolving and energetic cities in the world. But it's been 15 years, as Will said. So, at 15, I had a kid, and I started a practice at about the same time. And you get to 15 years, and you kind of think, you look at the kid, and you go, what the hell is going on with that? And you look at the practice, and you kind of start to wonder, what have we been doing, right? And so it's been a time for me to just kind of sit back and reflect a little bit about the various ways that we've been thinking about things and working on things for the last 15 years. And so some of what I want to talk about tonight is a new framing of some of that work. And I'll talk about that work in 4 categories. I think understanding that some of the discussion right now is around issues of resilience. I may focus a little bit more on some of those projects, a little bit less on some of the others for you. But we'll go through a series of topics and show you through research, through practice, through teaching, how it is that I and we in the office are starting to engage a wide range of issues. So first, flux. This idea of flux, or flows, or oscillations, the idea of being in a continuous state of change. This is an idea that's derived from a complex adaptive systems ecology, in which the world and its ecosystems are dynamic, constantly shifting, adapting, and evolving to environmental and human influence conditions. When I grew up, I was old enough to learn a different model of ecology. We learned the static state, the ideal forest, that all forests wanted to grow back and be the ideal forest. And so everything was about attaining that kind of ideal moment. Ecologists have thrown that idea out. A lot of the students in the room probably have no idea what I'm talking about, right? This is just not a worldview that you've learned. The new worldview is that things are always in a state of change, and in fact, ecosystem health is measured in terms of an ecosystem's ability to adapt and change over time. And so, there are folks like Odom that were looking very early on. This is 1971 at energies and flows through ecosystems. This is present in some of our own work. It's actually a diagram for a park, small park, waterfront park on Cape Cod. It's called State Shift, but the whole idea is how do we impregnate a park with the ability to shift states from dry to wet, from inundated to windy and dry, or what have you. In fact, we had set up 7 different scenarios that we could imagine, and then designed the park to kind of change and adapt itself according to whatever set of conditions arose at the time. It's not an idea that clients are comfortable with. You can't tell. A client's telling you to build a thing, and it's got to look this way, right? So it's not something we emphasize to public clients in our work, but it's something we build into the work so that the client 10, 15, 20 years down the line isn't stuck with a project which all of a sudden doesn't work. It's already starting to adapt over time. And these sort of interests led to the book that Will was talking about with Nina Marie Lister. Nina Marie is an ecologist and planner. I'm a designer. And we really took this on to say, what is the state of the art here? Ecology has been a topic for the last 20 years. So how is it that we start to look back at how that evolution happened, and also take a look at where we are now and where we're going forward? This book looked at some pretty groundbreaking work by folks like Odom and C.S. Halling. We republished a number of key essays, both written by ecologists and designers, that started to look at those relationships. We published new essays, and we also published a whole series of drawings that looked at dynamic systems. In fact, this one is our own redrawing of C.S. Halling's drawing of a system in a constant state of change. We thought his drawing, and this is even Nina Marie, not just the designers, didn't quite capture the 3- and 4-dimensionality of what Halling himself was trying to draw in 2 dimensions. And so we were able to take the opportunity to redraw things. We were looking at new software programs. This is a Aquaveo, a water flow software program. So we're looking at new technologies, all as a way to begin to rethink the way that we work in response to this ever-changing world that we're involved in. We take these issues on in school, and we do it at the scale of the city, at the urban district. So for a number of years, we were working in Jamaica Bay, Queens, New York City, a really dynamic environment. And on the one hand, we're looking often quite deliberately at change over time. You can see maps of the area and the various natural and human influence processes that really change the shoreline and the nature of water flows within the bay. But also the way that students were proposing reseeding dynamics within the bay through an earth building strategy that would really engage directly some of the water flows and dynamics that were out there, set the stage for land building, which in turn would set the stage for a very light urbanism that could continue to change over time and reformulate itself as sea level rose and fell and environmental dynamics changed and shifted. So there's some work here that in some ways is groundbreaking in terms of saying it's not just landscapes that change, but it's how is it that we design these principles into new urban fabrics that can always be responding to those environmental changes over time. We also use analogs of these ideas. This was one student, or a pair of students, who were looking not just at ecological dynamics. The stuff in orange is in the water, and they were setting up a sediment system to kind of move and change and create all these new ecologies. But they were also setting up a real estate game where, in exchange for height, you would get more open space and more ecology. So it was a game where usually environmental principles and real estate development are in opposition. They were looking for a way to put these things into a productive relationship. So in some ways, the more development you got, the better environment you got. And they did this through a real estate game that was really scenario-based and that could then be deployed across larger areas. And on the one hand, it's shocking to see that much density and development in Jamaica Bay. On the other hand, the ecological principles they were programming in allowed for fresher, cleaner water and better habitat than exists today. And so it's that game that these guys were interested in. Those ideas have made their way into our own work, site in Milwaukee, that tiny little site on the corner there. Industrial site, former industrial site, where all environmental dynamics were dead. It had been filled, it had been transformed, nothing was going on. And so here the very simple premise was how to re-inaugurate environmental dynamics on a site in a city that's meant for some kind of social occupation. So we were very much interested in topographic strategies that would start to redirect stormwater and in environmental strategies that would help to, on the one hand, buffer from cold winter winds, but also allow the dynamics of the river to enter into, quite literally, the public space. The project's quite simple. It's a grove of trees on one end that gradually gives way to open lawn and eventually to a lowland marsh. You can see here how stormwater is collected on the site, allowed to infiltrate, so that water goes into the groundwater or into the soil first. It's cleaned before it then goes into the groundwater. Excess water runs across the site, is collected in this lower area, which allows us to put in place a native marsh that the infrastructure that's here once displaced. In this case, the infrastructure is revealed. We've lowered the grade behind the wall to see the contrast between the infrastructure, to give legitimacy to the infrastructure as well as to the ecology. But the infrastructure is quite functional, too, in buffering this soft marsh from the wake of recreational and industrial boats that are moving past the site. So here you see how the site steps down. This is the marsh. I think this is late spring, early summer. The marsh floods quite regularly, these lower areas, so you see the presence of water and you make the connection to what's going on. You have this incredible series of blooms throughout the year. And we also set up this material relationship between the old rusty bulkhead walls, the really soft, lush, beautiful plant material, and then these new bench and lighting devices made out of fiberglass. So we're as interested in a kind of material dialogue in this case as we were in the pure functionality of the environment. For us, that's where the real design comes in. It's not just making good and healthy environments, it's also layering in explicit design references, sometimes quite subtle, but allow in ways that allow things to come to life and get them out of just the ordinary. And so it's a very passive site. It's really just a place to hang out and watch the activity of the river or watch the activity in the marsh. And for these guys, a healthy environment means more fish, and it means more fishermen catching fish to take home. So that's a kind of environmental version of Flux. I think there's also a social dimension to this as well, and it's something we were very much interested in at Harvard. On this site, here on a bridge that connects Harvard Yard to the North Campus. In many ways, the principles of environmental ecology, I think, can be applied to public space. If you have something that's diverse and flexible and adaptable at different times, I think you get a fairly healthy space. And so that kind of thinking, the kind of thinking influenced by William White, went into the thinking behind this space, which is quite dead when we found it. You can see Harvard Yard there. The Tanner Fountain by Pete Walker is to the left, CERT's Science Center building. But this was a place that nobody hung out in. They walked through. There were about 10,000, 15,000 people a day walking through the space. No one stopped to hang out, and you can see it was a pretty beaten up space. This was a project initiated by the president of the university, Drew Faust, to really radically remake that place as the center of campus life. Harvard had never had places where people from different parts of the university could just hang out or get together or interact. And so this was one of her first initiatives to create a series of social spaces across campus. On the one hand, it had to work for all the 10,000 and 15,000 people walking through it on a daily basis. And it also had to work for the everyday. You know, just the people who wanted to be there to casually hang out or to study or to eat. To help that along, we designed these benches. These are custom fabricated benches that allow people to sit and hang out in different ways. We all have different body types, right? We all like to sit in different ways. Sometimes it's just a mood thing. Sometimes you want to slouch. Sometimes you want to sit up properly. Sometimes you want somebody in your lap. Sometimes you want to kind of lay back and cuddle with somebody. You can do any of that stuff on these benches. You can get in trouble on these benches. But the whole idea is that there's always a place on one of those benches that you're going to feel comfortable on that particular day. We combine that with the movable chairs and furniture that says if you don't want one of the benches, just grab a chair and put it wherever you want. So the whole idea of flexibility that we're designing for multiple people, multiple bodies, multiple moods, and the place can really kind of change over the course of the day. And these things can be used in many ways, including, you know, hanging out and rubbing your belly. And of course, they're used as informal playthings as well. So the idea that a piece of design intended for one thing all of a sudden gets used in multiple ways is another of the ideas behind what we're trying to do here. And also the idea that we're creating active places and also quieter places off to the side within these garden groves. So again, what are the diversity of choices that you have in the public realm? It was also designed as an event destination plaza. And so there are a whole series of things inscribed into the plaza, utilities, tent foundations, water, power, all these things that actually allow the plaza to come to life in different ways. In fact, we inscribed across the surface many, many different kinds of programs, anything from crafts fairs to farmers markets, to art fairs during the summer, to large-scale performances, more formal performances, student boxing matches, who knew? Caught that one day. Ice skating, curling. Apparently one winter, some Canadians were in charge of the programming for the place and got some curling mats out. It's been used as a place of memorial. It's been used as a place of protest. So it's really come to life both in a programmed way and in an informal way. People have really kind of adapted this project to their own uses. And, you know, more conceptually, we like to develop our own scores of how the activity kind of ebbs and flows over the course of the day, over the course of the season. But the ideas inherent here in a social space are very much linked to those ideas of flux and dynamic and changeability that we were seeing with some of the ecological projects and in that first project as well. More recently, we're taking that, adding to it at the West Louisville Food Port. This is a project, OMA is designing it out of New York. It's a food hub, food distribution center, food processing, indoor vertical farm, community kitchens, food entrepreneurship, food retail. It has spaces for public events, but the landscape is planted with fruit and nut and food-bearing vegetation across the whole. And it's done on a 24-acre brownfield site in a pretty tough neighborhood in West Louisville that's used to having all the dirty industry thrown at it. In this case, we're very much engaging the community. And so it has everything. It's got sustainability, it's got food culture, it's got food sustainability, and it's got community interaction, and it's got a kind of high quality of design culture layered in as well. These are some of the internal uses, and the idea was that there would be a relationship between internal and external uses as well. External, really creating a series of dynamic public spaces that could be used in a number of different ways, a market plaza for various farmers markets and art installations, and temporary growing or long-term nursery operations, or over the longer term, the idea that we could begin to create a series of vines that would grow hops and other food products for use by some of the merchants right on the site. And the idea that the plaza would be designed, again, to be flexible, to come alive at certain points and to be quiet at other points. The Jefferson Plaza, designed almost like a slice of an orange. The idea that this would be the main gathering space, event space, performance space. So there are a whole series of programming ideas that are embedded into the design of this space, all revolving around a central space here with a collection of different landscape types. It's almost certainly programmed to accommodate different tents and events and community food festivals. But in the center is this kind of wagon wheel of slices of landscape. It's like you can find your own slice of landscape, whether it's a hard surface with paving, whether it's a bumpy rubber surface, whether it's a hill with flowering trees, or a wood deck that you can kind of sit and hang out on and sunbathe. There's a piece of landscape for everybody in the center. So it's really quite playful. The colors are intentionally quite vivid. In a way that brings to life. And the newest version of this has the surrounding tree planting all made of fruit and nut-bearing species. An outdoor play area, a demonstration farm where the Jefferson County Extension will be on site, demonstrating how to develop an urban farm in urban neighborhoods on contaminated soil. So a kind of educational and demonstration facility as well. And so all of these are now kind of taking that idea of ecology, taking that idea of social adaptability and pushing it even further into a dialogue about bigger questions of sustainability and resilience and food sourcing. Where do you get safe and healthy food when you're in the urban environment? So a much broader idea of, or response to the question of urban resiliency. A couple categories, other categories of work. These two I'll probably skip over quite quickly so I can save time for the last one. Generative processes, the idea of, just the question of where do we start? How do we work? How are ideas and forms generated in the work that we do? I was recently asked to give a talk to 7th graders. One of my kids is a 7th grader. They were doing a new schoolyard garden, and a call went out, is there a parent that's a landscape architect who can come to talk to us about how you make a garden? And so somebody found out that was me. And so I had to go and make a presentation, and I sat there in the office going, oh shit, how do you make a garden? What do you need? What are the fundamental things you tell us 7th grade students, 12-year-old kids, 13-year-old boys and girls? How do you make a garden? So I asked my intern, and she put together a good slideshow for me, food or water and soil and light and those sorts of things. But it reminded me that at a certain level we're talking about fundamentals. What are the things that you do? What are the things that influence you? Whether it's cultural, whether it's recreational, whether it's social, whether it's environmental. This is an Instagram feed of mine from various running and biking excursions over the course of the last year. If you follow me, you can always see where I'm running or biking because I record it. And it gives you a kind of wide array of places and things that I'm looking at and seeing in the course of my everyday life that are starting to influence the way that I think and the way that I work. It's also a question of how is design generated? And in the age of digital technology, what is the relationship between analog drawing and digital drawing, right? And how is there a kind of fluidity back and forth within the office between those modes of making? It's also a question of, what inspires you. And I've already talked about people and the social. People are pretty interesting. That's a student, clearly, sitting around taking an afternoon nap. But people are quite crazy. I mean, this guy on our project in Green Bay does not give a shit in the world about what you think of him, right? He is out there enjoying the sun for all it's worth and loving it. Or these ladies who have decided they're not going to sit inside the cafe, they're not going to sit outside the cafe, they're going to squeeze themselves in between these cars. Like, people will do the nuttiest things. And you need to design for that. You need to allow that to happen. You need to anticipate certain characteristics, certain curiosities, and then allow other things to just kind of happen on their own. You're never going to be able to control that. In terms of generative software tools, we use a lot of them in the office. This was our Christmas card, where we generated a snowflake using grasshopper scripts. This is one of those things you think is going to take 10 minutes and takes 3 or 4 days, and you've wasted a lot of time and money. But it becomes an exercise for us in how do you begin to think and work, and in what other ways can you begin to think about using some of those technologies to generate landform and landscape and even furniture. And so we're using generative and associative parametric software very much in a lot of the fabrication work that we're doing in the office. The benches at Harvard went through a lot of design testing. We set these up so that you essentially create sectional profiles, and then you use these tools to script the transitions in between so that you get a multiplicity of different conditions. And yet, because of the way that we're repeating certain elements on the benches, you're able to manufacture these in a way which is somewhat efficient. Replicable parts that can be assembled in different ways to create some of these forms. And the great part about this is that some of the same tools that we're using in the office get transmitted to the fabricators themselves and then modified, so that we're not handing them a drawing, we're actually handing them our digital models, and they take those right into their own warehouse to begin to make these. It's also nice because if one of those ribs is damaged, they're all numbered. And all the university has to do is call up the fabricator and say, I need number B105, and they'll just make another one and deliver it to site, and it gets reinstalled. So it's really quite efficient. At the University of Michigan, we're designing a 4-acre quad, really quite lush and soft, but are again using associative software to work on some of the benches here. And the most overly articulated concrete paving pattern, I think, that will emerge in a while. These are just the control joints that you see in concrete. But we're playing with these software technologies in a way that allows us to explore different forms, different construction techniques. You can see here the benches are embedded into the hillside. They start as curbs, they go to seat walls, they go up to full-size benches. At a certain point, they transition from concrete to metal, and then back to concrete again. And essentially, all of these things, which look absolutely custom-made, are made from a kit of parts. So each of these sections, elevations, are labeled and numbered, and those are the modules that are created. So we have, what's that, 30, 35 modules, but they're each made a number of different times and then deployed across the site, assembled in different ways, so that you get a lot of variability out of a more limited set of parts. And that's what some of these software technologies allow us to do. And so we've been exploring through furniture, other really quite luxurious benches here, but we're also testing this in school, looking at how you generate landform in response to water flows and social uses. This is some student work looking just at iterative studies of landform in relationship to water flow, water inundation, and how landscape can begin to function hydrologically, ecologically, and create some pretty robust landscapes at the same time. We're then taking that into the realm of the city as well, to say once you begin to develop a foundation of landform and infrastructure, you can begin to use those same tools and technologies to build buildings and urban fabrics on top of those. These are typological, so that if a set of conditions change, you have the same kit of parts, you just rearrange them in different ways. And this one happens to be quite influenced on the ground level by flow of water, and up top by the way the buildings are cut are all influenced by sun angles at different times of year that allow those buildings to perform environmentally really quite well. So it may look funny, but it's actually performing quite dramatically. A third category, what time is it? 7:45. Weak systems. This is what I'm not going to talk about. I want to skip over a couple things. This is a beautiful project that we lost in a competition. Makes me very sad. We're really good at losing competitions. Some of them hurt more than others. Wouldn't you have wanted to go there? So weak systems, we work in cities like Detroit, New Orleans, cities you might think of as shrinking cities, cities with weak governments, weak economies, where development is not the driver, right? And so how do you create a kind of just, equitable, environmentally sound city in places like this, where the market's not driving it? These are areas that are heavily vacated because populations have simply moved elsewhere in response to jobs. This is a vacancy map of all of Detroit. And there are racial issues there. There are public health issues, which are often tied to minority populations, because minorities were redlined into districts near polluting industries and transportation corridors. There are public health issues. There are environmental health issues. And it goes way beyond just the economics of the city. It's really how the city, how healthy or unhealthy the city is socially, environmentally. And so this work really looked to create a series of productive landscapes that could help to kind of clean the city, improve public health, improve social health. And it did so using a series of different typological open space types, not just public parks, which generally require a decent amount of maintenance. But the idea here was, how do we define certain conditions on the ground, and each set of conditions, their physical conditions, environmental conditions, and economic conditions, are designated with different colors on this map. So some of the most intensely vacated, low economic potential are the purple areas, whereas some of the stronger, more settled, occupied areas are the darker and medium blue areas. So there are a whole series of conditions on the ground, and this is where we said, look, we imagine this urban fabric changing in a number of ways. We're not going to plan 130 square miles of fabric, But what we are going to give you is the tools. Once you identify what the initial conditions are, you then have a series of options for how you develop landscape and urban typologies for that future in ways that improve environmental health, improve community opportunities for community interaction, that provide jobs, that provide new forms of economy, using landscape as an asset and landscape as a key. Detroit and cities like Detroit have opportunities that cities like New York, Boston, and San Francisco don't have. They have land. And so here the opportunity was, how do you transform vacancy into real opportunities for people, for environment, for micro or macro economies that could begin to emerge over time. So very much a system that's not really driven by the market, but is market tested. This was all modeled so that the relationship between projected property taxes generated in the areas we wanted to densify could cover the cost to service all the areas that we were imagining across the city. So there is an economic component to this, but a different kind of sustainable city for a city that's not growing, but is actually stabilizing or have been shrinking. Even down to the scale of the individual vacant lot, through a series of decision matrices, ultimately people on the ground would be able to choose between a number of different futures for each individual place. So in that sense, too, we were setting up a system and a way to begin to think through different scenarios and ultimately leaving the decisions to people on the ground. I'm going to skip this project to get to this last category that I'm calling dynamic frames. Here I'm thinking about not single-minded, hard and fast infrastructures. Rather, I'm thinking about scaffolds that bring to light conditions or change, and I'm showing Robert Smithson's spiral jetty as an installation, a scaffold that in many ways bring to light the environmental dynamics and change that go on in this part of Utah. Or that establish loose frames that can instigate appropriation, growth, and change. Think of infrastructure as a catalyst rather than an end in itself. Or simply dynamic and multifunctional themselves, able to adapt to ongoing physical, environmental, social, political, and economic changes. Very much the work in Green Bay, Wisconsin is like this. You can call this an open space, you can call it a riverfront. I tend to think about it as a piece of infrastructure, social and civic infrastructure, that gives rise to certain economic development opportunities behind it, and certainly give rise to other kinds of social and environmental opportunities as well. This is a project where downtown had been abandoned, the riverfront had been abandoned, there was no way to get up to the city, nowhere to get down to the river, and what we wanted to do was create a whole series of different experiences on and along the river. This was an early version of some of the furnishing ideas that we've talked about in other projects. Tuned toward a different set of budgetary constraints and construction technologies and abilities for a client to maintain it, but embedded with a lot of the same ideas. How do you give people a sense of choice and flexibility in the seating? How can you design for individual moments or collective experiences, whether it's just a few people hanging out to experience sunset over the river, or a morning yoga class? I find that if you get a yoga class to spontaneously show up in a landscape that you've designed, you call that success, and take a picture of it. And just, these everyday moments where you can experience the culture of the river, the culture of the city. So it's really, in some ways, its design is intentional to get you to different places, down to the water, intermediate places, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, it's just a scaffold that allows people to appropriate this thing in different ways and kind of bring to really inaugurate a new sense of civic life year-round on the waterfront. This project I'm going to skip so I can get to project in Dallas. This was a competition. This competition we won, and then there was no prize. We eventually got a project out of it that's now on hold. So it's like whenever we win a competition, there's nothing. And then the rest of the time we just lose competitions. This one was interesting because this is downtown Dallas. There was a moment, the old Trinity River used to be here right at the foot of downtown. And in the early 20th century, it flooded downtown a number of times. And so they decided to push the river away from downtown, realigned it over here, put it in the middle of some levees. And then once they pushed the river away, they started missing the river and longing for the river again. So this competition was essentially how do you reconnect the downtown to the riverfront through 500 acres of land that over time had accumulated stuff like this. TxDOT is one of the more amazing highway departments in the world. I mean, they are not shy about building highway infrastructure. And what's amazing is they were in the process of tripling the size of these highway interchanges during the competition, right? Those things were not going away. What I love about projects like this in places like Dallas, you can't do New York, Boston, San Francisco urbanism here. You're not going to get all of Texas out of their cars and pickup trucks, right? You have to take seriously the 20th century city and figure out how do you build a new model for urbanism that's authentic to places like this. So a lot of highway infrastructure, some jails, some roadway infrastructure. But the real fundamental question is how do you make this connection, right? For us, the way to do it was this fingering strategy. How do you take new neighborhoods and extend city fabric directly to the edge of the river and do it in ways that are more easily developable? And how do you take some of the difficult sites, the highway interchanges, and bring landscape in from the river and create this alternating grid green structure? In a way, you're actually creating economic opportunity because instead of the city having one face that opens to a park or a waterfront, you now have a much longer line of interface. So in taking away land, you've actually raised property value and real estate value. So it's as much an environmental strategy as it is an economic development strategy. And then here the question was, how do you revive the old river, which existed in these old forlorn, dirty ditches that collected all the city's stormwater before it was then pumped inside the levee system? I mean, that's the problem with levees, right? The levees contain the flood most of the time, not always. But then you have to figure out how to get the water inside the levee. And so there's a whole series of pumps and sumps. We really imagined transforming that system, that what we were doing is building the series of new neighborhoods and landscapes on a refashioned stormwater system with stormwater terraces that would clean the water, polish it to the level of allowing for human contact, and yet still functioning for the flood control that it already was, and then starting to design water-based landscapes around the water system. In one place, we were talking about designing an urban beach right in the heart of the city, in the middle of a new design district, a viaduct amphitheater, a water amphitheater that would become the heart of a really intensely developed high-density neighborhood right on the edge of downtown, a real celebratory space for the city. And then a third neighborhood, the Riverfront South neighborhood, built along these water gardens. So again, mixed use, mostly residential to support people who could walk or ride their bike into downtown. But using this series of water gardens, refashioned stormwater sumps as an economic catalyst that would allow for a form of dense urbanity that wouldn't otherwise have been possible in a place like this. So here we were capturing stormwater off of roofs from the local district, but developing a system that would allow water coming in from other parts of the city to go through a series of stormwater terraces here, here, and here. And so you capture the sediment, you clean the water, and then in this one area, you begin to design that as a much more intensely developed public space. This is the piece that we've moved forward with hydrologic engineers, Limnotech out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we're really designing this as a series of program spaces, so cafes, sloping lawns, terraces, music gardens, small gallery spaces, within a landscape that's designed to flood, and within a landscape that's designed to dramatize the flood, so that it's safe to come here when the water is pouring in from other parts of the city, but it's also a reason to come here during some of the rainier times of the season. So here we're really taking that infrastructural resource, cleaning it up, making it into an environmental and social resource, and then dramatizing the effects of it in the everyday life of a series of gardens. We're also embedding into this plant materials that can survive severe drought and severe flood at the same time. So again, building in a kind of ecological resilience as well, and finding ways for projects like this to co-opt some of the leftover single-minded infrastructures from the 20th century and make them much more viable, flexible, dynamic infrastructures, environmental, social, and functional infrastructures for a new generation of cities to come. So in many ways, just to wrap up and to summarize, I think at the core of all this work is a dogged interest in the various ways landscape, living, breathing, and operative, might play a more formative role in the reimagining and remaking of cities' public spaces and metropolitan regions. In an era of climate change, rapid urbanization, social inequities, and cultural debate, landscape offers a profound and functional and inventive starting point for rethinking the ways that we live. Thanks. Happy to take some questions.
Clearly, a lot of the projects you presented here really are really innovative and really break the mold of traditional urbanism. Do you ever find it difficult to present these to clients without scaring them off, really?
They always worry about the function. Does that thing really flood? Because it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like the things they're using now that flood.